Each year in the month of May, there is an exercise that high school graduates partake of called Commencement Exercises. In just a few short months, if these ladies haven't thought of it yet, Miss Lauren and Miss Marissa will be participating in commencement exercises. At least that is our hope, right? Still a few months left. Commencement actually happens and occurs at the conclusion of a high school student's tenure, but in reality, the term commencement does not mean conclusion at all. It means beginning. And if a commencement exercise is done correctly, then the focus is on a new chapter of one's life, particularly college and or career. A new chapter by which they get a little more freedom now and a little more responsibility than they used to. In this new chapter, they will not have their parents tell them to do their homework. They will not have their parents tell them to clean their room, how to spend their money, and a host of other issues. That really is what the concept of commencement means, but you and I both know that it often goes into a sort of conclusion of one's life, where graduating and commencement is also an ending of 12 years of an academic world that involves deadlines and term papers, varsity lettermans and dances, and most particularly, relationships. And life being what it is, those relationships, at least most of them, will end. I was very close with my high school class, many of them. I probably talked to one regularly. The others would be stunned to know that I'm a pastor today. And I don't think I speak for myself, would never want to go back to high school. The closest I come to high school is binge watching John Hughes flicks. That's the closest thing. Give me Breakfast Club, I'm fine. But don't let me go back to high school, because only by God's grace of the things I did in high school can I only say that for my fortune I did under the age of 18, so I cannot be responsible for what I said or did. But I did some stupid things. Things that in God's grace He grew me up on. When I was in high school, for example, I thought I knew everything. And I knew diddly squat. But you couldn't tell me. I had to learn that. When I was in high school, I struggled with self-esteem issues and peer pressure and all of those things. But I went to commencement and I said goodbye to those friends, and I grew up and matured. Though I'm not perfect and still say stupid things that I regret, hopefully I don't do it with the regularity I did when I was in high school. But nonetheless, you couldn't pay me enough money to go back. I've met some people that I think they've never left high school. 40-year-old adolescents who sit at Applebee's talking about the good old days when they were a varsity letterman, and you're thinking to yourself, what have you done the last 18 years of your life? It's sort of sad. We're not made to linger in that time period. We're made to mature and grow up. Can you imagine a Church of Jesus Christ that has tasted the gospel, been liberated from sin, now are mature beings in freedom in Christ, desiring to go back to high school, under the law, in bondage to sin? If it's bombastic for you to think about, that's precisely the Church of Galatia. In fact, at the end, verse 11, when we get there, Paul is so aghast. He says, it was a waste of my time to be with you if you're going to go back. My 3-year ministry, traveling 1,500 miles across land and sea to spend 3 years planting a dozen churches in Galatia, was a joke, a waste, a blank, a gap. I shouldn't even come to do what you're doing now. And what are they doing? They have tasted the gospel of Jesus Christ, been liberated from their sin, living in grace, and a bunch of hucksters have come in the church infiltrating, saying, you got to go back under the law, i.e., you got to go back as if Christ hadn't died and risen before. In effect, you got to go back to high school. Anyone ever watched the movie by Rodney Dangerfield, Back to School? I mean, what an absolute joke. And that's what we have, sadly, with the Church of Galatia. They are one colossal joke with the gospel. This is not how you act in Jesus. And so once again, now those of you that have been here since May, this is a battering ram, a broken record, but once again, Paul is desperately appealing with his pen for the church to turn back, because he knows if you don't, you'll lose the gospel, and you never really had it if you go back. Now, the way he does this is in the concept of a family. He started in chapter 3, verse 26, with this idea of sons. He ends chapter 3 with this idea of heirs. He begins chapter 4, verse 1 with this idea of heirs, which is a family concept. He concludes his first section with verse 7, talking about being heirs of a family, and he continues through chapter 4 with the concept of family. So for Paul, anytime, and he's a master at this, probably more prolific than any other New Testament writer, when a church begins to go off the grid, off the rails, and it's very pastoral, and something you can do as a parent, by the way, when you have to get your kids back in line, is he always is starting with identity. What are you? My dad always used to do that. My parents never gave me a curfew, but when I used to take my hot rod Mustang and I had a lot of testosterone, my dad knew this could be a bad mix. So before I went out on Friday nights with, whoever, he always used to say, now, Bryzy, remember who you are and where you come from. He always used to say that. Just remember who you are and where you come from. And Paul does that, and he does it here. Remember who you are. Why would you go back under the law? That's not you. Because his definition in chapter 3 and 4 of a Christian is a member of the family of God. That's your identity. So I'm looking out, according to Paul's eyes, at sons and daughters who call God Father and Christ our brother, and we are heirs together. We are not illegal aliens. We're not out in the cold. We're not slaves. We're not illegitimate. We're all family. That's the main concept of Paul. He's trying to push in the church, so act like it. Act like your brothers and sisters. Act like your sons and daughters. Now, he brings up this concept in chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3 that I'm not going to beat to death because this will be the third week in a row I've talked about it. That's this image of a pedagogue, but he brings it up again because it's prolific in Paul's day. Our day, we send our kids to boarding schools or get a nanny, but that's the closest thing to a pedagogue. And if you're a well-to-do father, both in Greek and Roman, and Josephus, the Jewish scholar, had a pedagogue for his 2 boys. You hire out, usually a slave, to raise your son. They start at 6, they usually end at 16, and they become a man. And there's a ceremony. We talked all about that last week. Fathers knew that, You know, it's dangerous to give your kids inheritance prematurely. A 5-year-old, just like he can't appreciate a ribeye steak, he probably can't appreciate the family inheritance. So it took training to get there. Do you remember the story of the prodigal son? Part of the failure of that son is he got his inheritance prematurely. Remember, he demanded it. He came to his dad, who had not yet bestowed upon him the coming-of-age sonship. He comes to his dad and says, "Give me my inheritance now." His dad doesn't fight with him, but he gives it to him, and what's the boy? He doesn't know how to handle it. So he blows it all and comes back, embarrassed. That's what is trying to be prevented with the pedagogue. And that's what Paul says, that before you were Christ, you were under a guardian. That's the law. So he talks about this idea of sonship, but in the midst of coming into the family, he states a problem. So he begins to mix images. And the problem is articulated here in the key verse of verse 4, where Paul says that verse 5, that we might be adopted as sons with full rights. So now, for the first time in his letter, Paul brings a concept to really throw us a curveball. If we're adopted as sons and daughters into the family, that means we are not legitimately born, begotten by blood, sons and daughters of God. To be adopted means you don't have biological parents that's adopting you, hence the concept. And if you look at what Paul says prior to this verse and after this verse, you and I are in a real pickle. Because Paul states exactly what our natural inclinations are. When he says that we were under guardians and this is verse 2, by the way, until the date set by our father. So also, when we were minors, were enslaved under the basic forces of this world. That was your life before. And he says that beginning in verse 8, when he says, formerly, in the past, before you met Christ, what was your life? What does he say? He expands this. You did not know God before. And I love his line, by the way, when he says there in the next verse, now when you came to know God, and this is beautiful, or rather, when you were known by God. That's really the issue. God sought you out and got to know you first. But when you did not know God, verse 8, formerly you were enslaved to beings that by nature are not God's at all. But now that you've come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back to the weak and worthless basic forces to be enslaved to them all over again? He is describing that is our real life, our natural inclinations before we were adopted by God. Our real family is the natural forces of this world. Now, that is a lunch discussion. This is a controversial issue. If you consulted 6 commentaries, you're going to have 16 opinions. And I'm going to be honest, I really can't say with confidence which is the right one, but I can give you a little bit from the text that you see and what the Greco-Roman world said with this concept of elemental forces. What really is that? And there's a lot of debate about what Paul is going. And he says the same thing in Colossians, by the way. In Greco-Roman world, when this word is used, elemental forces, they are describing the basic elements they believed of this world: water, air, earth, and fire. They would not use those elements for the heavenly world. That was an altogether different world where the gods ruled. But in this corrupt, broken down world, the basic elements of this world were those. And Paul takes off on that using this, and all we know of these basic elements are in opposition to God, right? Because they all occur before we know God. They are worthless. That's the term that Paul uses, to be worshipped. And so probably what Paul is getting at, and I'm still not there in terms of what specifically it is. I'm not really for sure. But what confidence I can say is when Paul is describing the elementary things that we're after, it is not God. We did it before we knew him. We tried to worship them. It's this world system and whatever it contains. And Paul's whole point is that was your natural inclination. That's what you were born in. That's your DNA and mine. And so adoption suggests that a change had to be made because you are not from, adoption means you're not from biological parents. Now let me say something about this key word adoption. This is the first time in Paul's writings where he mentions it. If you're like me and you believe Galatians was the earliest letter in the New Testament, it's the first time the Christian church is hearing about adoption. No other writer, by the way, mentions adoption except Paul. Nobody. Paul, he's on his own when he talks about the concept of adoption, and I mean redemptively. Everybody in the Greco-Roman world knew the biological, legal concept of adoption because it happened all the time. During adoption, legal adoption, there were several reasons why people adopted, and there were several reasons why people gave their child up for adoption, but there are two primary ones that occur more than any in ancient world. If you are the biological family and you put your child up for adoption, the overwhelming reason you do it is for monetary reasons. Either you've got 11 kids and you can't support any, so you sell to make money to put bread on the table. Or more often, you're from a low income status family, which was 2/3 of the Roman Empire. And you have a family that will adopt your child, and they're a high status, and they can give your kid an opportunity in life that you can't give. You put them up for adoption. And this happened all the time. And if you think that's morbid or crude, it was still happening in our culture during the Great Depression. There are records in Canada and the United States where parents are doing this with their kids. So that's the number one reason in the ancient world why you put your kid up for adoption, economics. If you were an adoptee family, the number one reason you adopted is to carry on the family name. You wanted an heir. You wanted to increase the family name, so you usually adopted a son. Daughters sometimes, but it was usually sons. Those were the reasons for adoption, to carry on the family name. That will come back in Paul's letters. Why did the Father adopt us? To carry on his name. And during adoption, there were 3 people involved. In addition to the child being adopted, the 3 people was the biological father, the adopting father, and a witness, typically a magistrate, that could legalize it. When the process would be negotiated and there would actually be a legal ceremony, the day that came, all would show up, and the biological father would go first. And he would, and there is a Latin phrase for it, but basically he would renounce any rights and authority and claim and name of that child. And he would do it not once, he would do it 3 times in front of the magistrate. And the reason for that, it was to give anybody the opportunity to bow out if they had second thoughts. So he'd do it once, he'd do it twice, he'd do it 3 times. He would renounce his claim. And once that was done and was legal, he could bump into this son on the street and he would just act like it was any other boy. The second process in adoption was the pronouncement on the position of the adoptee father, where he would pronounce this boy as his own. He would take his name. It wouldn't matter if the boy brought any debt in. They would be liberated and emancipated. He would take on a whole new identity as this new man's son. And he would say it 3 times. to give every chance to back out. Once that was done, then the agreed upon purchase price for the son would be exchanged. The adoptive father would lay it down, that dowry, and the biological father would pick it up. And then the magistrate would take a legal document. You can actually find these if you work hard on Google in the first century, where with parchment, he would write the new name, because names were changed, of the child, and beneath it would be the Greek phrase, new birth, new life. And many times, that was their new birthday. So in the ancient world, if you ask how old you are, they would not go by their biological age, they would go by their adopted age. This happened all the time. One of the most famous adoption issues came at the end of the in the 60s, at the first century, involving, well, it came before actually, but what I'm about to tell you came in the 60s. The Roman Emperor Claudius had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. The son died. So Claudius had no male heir to take on the Roman emperor upon his death, so he adopted a boy that came from a low-class family. He adopted him and gave him his new name, and his new name was Nero. So Nero is an adopted son of Claudius. He did that to have an heir to the throne. We kind of think because of Nero's reign, could we have skipped that one? But anyway, Nero comes to reign as emperor after Claudius dies, and he falls in love with a woman named Octavia. But there was one problem. Octavia was Claudius's daughter. And so Roman law was, because he was adopted, he was treated as Octavia's brother, even though they weren't biologically related. So it actually had to take a legislative act. Isn't it amazing when politicians want their way, how they can do that? It had to take a legislative act before the Roman government to switch that so that Nero could marry, in effect, his half-sister. Because Roman society said, no, you're legally his brother, and you can't do that. But he did it anyway, and that happens. So when Paul says what he says here, and he says that we grew up in one family, and that family's natural inclinations was not to know God, was to go after the things of this world that Paul later describes here, simply worthless and empty. And we were held under the law by it as actually protector. That's what the law did, to protect us from that world we knew of lapsing into utter paganism. And we know that didn't work for Israel in the Old Testament because they lapsed into paganism a lot. But there was a day where the Father said we had grown up to maturity. And how does Paul describe it in verse 4? But when the fullness of time, or when the appropriate time came, the Father adopted us as full rights as sons and daughters. Now that you know what I've just described the process, the Father renounced our old life, renounced that identity we had with the old world. Everything about our old life in sin is gone because of the pronouncement of the Father and pronouncing you and I as sons of God. And what does that mean? That means we get His name, His identity, His family, His inheritance. In a word, a new life. That's what we get. And the price of that adoption, Paul says, was the highest price imaginable. When the appropriate time had come, God sent out His own Son. Do you get the contrast? We are not begotten sons of God. He only has one of those. We don't get the Father's DNA when we're born into this world. We have to be adopted in. He only has one son, and that son he sent out, born of a woman, born under the law, to speak against the earthiness of this son. He had to come under the law and under the woman like we did, in order to redeem those. Redemption is an economic term in the Bible, usually used for the emancipation of slaves. You buy a slave to pay their freedom. In this case, the price for your freedom, the price for your and I's entrance into the Father, is the only son he had. Now think about that for a moment. On one end it shows how bad sin is, that the price of God's only son can redeem it. But it also shows, you want to see how good and how beautiful and how loving the Father is to us? The only son he had became the purchase price so that he could get all of us into his family. And brothers and sisters, so you're not, because this is all important for Paul about identity, because some of you beat yourself up. I don't know what you walked into. Maybe you think you're terrible. Maybe you don't think God loves you. But if so, your eyes need to stare long and hard at verse 7, where Paul says, not because you feel like it, not because you made an affirmation when you walked in here, not because you have a warm fuzzy. It's all about what the Father said and did for you. And verse 7, Paul concludes this by saying, you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if you're a son, guess what? You're an heir. Does that sink in? Let me put it. You are as much an heir as the Father as Jesus is. Not because you're better, not because you're equal. He's an heir, so are you. And because of that, he says right before that, guess what? You and I, at any moment, can go to God and call him Father. They didn't do that in the Old Testament. You won't have any verse of any individual in the Old Testament going to God and praying Father. In the New Testament, you get it about 500 times, where Jesus comes and says, when you pray, you don't talk to God like a pagan. You talk to God in intimate terms as a father, because that he is. Isn't that a wonderful thing? In the first century, I don't know what emperor it was, but there was a victory parade. And the emperor in downtown Rome was going through his golden chariot, being driven by 4 white horses, which was standard, getting all the accolades, all the people praising him. And a little boy worked his way through the crowd, and he started to head out in the path of the chariot, and some Roman centurions grabbed him, and he said, boy, you can't go out there. Don't you know who that is? That's the emperor. To which the boy said, he may be your emperor, but he's my father. And you better believe I have access to him. And the boy runs and hops in the chariot with his dad. God is our God, absolutely. But he's also our Father, who we go to, and it's only because of his Son, Jesus Christ, that makes that possible. Now, I wish that the letter ended here, like credits to, I don't know, a nice romantic comedy, happily ever after. 2 people kiss in the sunset, and the credits go up, and we're done, but the credits don't go up. Paul has just presented what I presented to you in letter form, and then he now has to go back to the mess of the Church of Galatia. And he's absolutely stunned of what they've done. And so in verse 8, it starts off with this, when he said, you did not know God, but by the end of it, he says, I fear that my work for you may have been in vain. That's a pastor talking, and it's not a happy pastor. Happy churches have happy pastors, and vice versa. You don't want a sad pastor who looks at their people with consternation and regret. The last thing, or one of the last things you would want me to say to you is the last 18 years of my life has been a waste with you. I should have been a motivational speaker when it was offered to me and got a 6-figure salary and had a much better life to just spend it with you the last 18 years because this has been an absolute joke. I regret. I mean, we would go get another job. I mean, it would be, that's what Paul's saying. I can't believe for the life of me, everything I just said, what happened at the cross. And you've experienced that by His grace. You would have the temerity and the stupidity to go back to high school. You've been liberated from sin. The Father did this free of charge without you. He came to you first and knew you. He gave His only begotten Son. He's rescued you from slavery, given you freedom. You can talk to Him any way you want, anytime you want as Dad. And you say, thanks, no thanks, we'll go back under the law. And that's when He says in the last verse there, verse 11, I think the last 3 years have been a waste. If you're going to do that, you haven't heard a blessed thing I have to say. Pastors get into that from time to time with certain particular people. Just think, do you even listen to what I say? Why are you doing that? But Paul is right. Can you imagine his heavy heart here? For a church to go back under the law as if Jesus hadn't happened. But Jesus has happened. And it's a good thing what's happened to us. So live that way. This is why, beloved, as we close, it is a tragedy for a church to even flirt with self-righteous works. To suggest that, yes, we need to do this as a church and behave this apart from the gospel, it is a dangerous road. If you're here today without Jesus and you walked in this room, this is good news. That you can actually have access to God. That, by the way, was the number one reason the first century church made a difference in their pagan world. Is because these weirdo Christians went around talking to their God as daddy. They don't address their pagan deities that way. And so what turned the pagan world onto Christianity is for the first time they heard a group of people saying, you can have a personal relationship with a God. You can talk to Him and walk with Him. He can talk and walk. And that's what I'm offering today in the 21st century. To those of you that walked in, you don't know if God knows you, cares, loves you, is distant, indifferent, you don't know. I'm offering you through Jesus Christ, you can know God personally, by name. You can walk with Him and talk with Him. And I will stand here and say, He will never let you down. Though you won't always understand His ways. He is a good Father, a heavenly Father, the best of fathers. Speaking of fathers, I had a pretty good one, a biological one on this earth. It's hard to believe, but the last day of this month celebrates his 14th year of passing. It's remarkable in many ways. And my father, I've mentioned this before, I won't beat a dead horse, really was my best friend. I struck the lottery with my parents. And my dad was really one of my best friends. And I remember the day he died, I actually was with my dad, and I think maybe some of you guys were with him too. We went down there to his farm on a Saturday, and he was to come up and died that Tuesday. So life is so short. And I remember going to his house the day he died and, trying to take care of my mom and manage everything. And Later that evening, I went down to his desk that we always nicknamed the hole, because he's held up in his hole. It was man cave before man caves were sexy, okay? And his hole was basically a desk of concrete cinder blocks. And I remember that evening sitting in my father's chair, and that's when it all hit me. 24 hours ago, he was sitting in this chair, paying bills. And my father would sit in that chair and do a lot of things. He would pay his bills, he would read his Bible, he would read books. A peculiar thing my father did, because he was from the Great Depression era, he kept everything. He was a pack rat. And every Christmas card anybody ever sent to him, he had a magnet on his file, and he would pray through everybody that sent him a Christmas card every day. And he would check it off. He would check up on them. And he sat in that chair and did it. And so that day of his death, I sat there in his chair, and all that came rushing onto me as that time ended for me. The best news of all is my father's chair sits in a royal room. My father's chair holds glory beyond the tomb. My father's chair, my God is there, and I am his eternal heir. And one day I'll share my father's chair. Father, it is good to call you Father only because of Christ. But we do call you Father. And we enjoy this family together. I pray for this family that you would unite us and keep us united in the gospel. Father, as we take up this meal, which is the supper of your Son, would we remember that we are brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of God through the body and blood of your Son. This I ask in the name of Jesus our Lord and for his sake.